May 10th, 1996. High above, at over 8,000 meters, climbers on Mount Everest are moments away from reaching the summit. The air is thin, their bodies are weak, but the goal is within sight. Suddenly, a powerful storm sweeps over the mountain, changing everything. Winds howl, snow blinds, and temperatures drop to deadly lows. Within minutes, what was a journey of triumph turns into a desperate fight for survival. Rob Hall, a seasoned guide, radios for help. "I'm stuck at the top," he says, his voice barely audible through the storm. He is not alone. Others are scattered across the slope, some clinging to life, others losing their way in the blinding whiteout. Down below, base camp scrambles into action. Rescue teams gear up, but the storm is too fierce. Every second counts. Every decision is a matter of life and death. The mountain is unforgiving. As night falls, hopes dim. Some climbers are rescued, while others vanish into the icy darkness, never to be seen again. What happened next is a story of bravery, mistakes, and the harsh reality of one of the deadliest days in Everest's history. How did things go so terribly wrong that day? How did a dream climb turn into one of Everest's deadliest disasters? It was early May 1996, and the weather reports suggested a brief window of good weather for a summit attempt. Among the climbers were experienced guides like Rob Hall, the head of adventure consultants, and Scott Fisher, leading the Mountain Madness expedition. Both men were seasoned mountaineers with multiple Everest summits under their belts, each leading their teams with confidence. They knew the risks of climbing the world's highest peak, standing at 29,032 feet, where the air was thin and the weather unpredictable. Yet these climbers were prepared. They had trained rigorously for years, building endurance, mastering technical skills, and understanding the harsh realities of high-altitude climbing. The journey to the top of Everest is not a straightforward ascent. The climbers must first pass through several camps to acclimate to the thinning air. As the days passed, the teams began their climb. They moved slowly, pacing themselves, allowing their bodies to adjust to the lack of oxygen. Their first major challenge was the Khumbu Icefall, a treacherous section filled with massive blocks of ice and deep crevasses that could swallow a person whole. The climbers had to cross shaky ladders laid over these gaps, one step at a time, knowing that a single misstep could mean disaster. For many, this was the first real test of their courage and skills. It was a place where even the most seasoned climbers felt their hearts race. Each step required balance, careful planning, and nerves of steel. The sound of ice cracking and shifting around them was a constant reminder of the dangers they faced. After successfully navigating the icefall, they moved on to Camp 2, located at 21,300 feet. Here, the climbers took a brief rest to recover and adjust to the altitude. The camp was nestled in the western CWM, a relatively flat glacial valley, but the calmness was deceptive. Surrounding the camp were towering walls of ice, and the risk of avalanches was ever present. As they moved higher to Camp 3, perched on the steep slope of the Ilhatsi face at 23,500 feet, the terrain became even more challenging. The temperatures dropped, the wind picked up, and the oxygen levels fell dramatically. The climbers had to use ropes to pull themselves up the icy slopes, each step an exhausting effort. The higher they climbed, the slower their pace, as every movement took a toll on their energy levels. By May 10th, the climbers reached Camp 4, located at 26,000 feet, the last stop before the summit. This camp, situated in what is known as the death zone, is where the human body begins to shut down due to the extreme altitude. Here, the oxygen is so thin that even with supplemental oxygen tanks, every breath is a struggle. The climbers were exhausted, but their spirits remained high. They knew the summit was within reach, just a few hours away. They rested briefly, trying to conserve their strength for the final push. However, time was not on their side. The weather on Everest is notoriously unpredictable, and every moment spent waiting was a moment lost. As the climbers set out for the summit late that night, they faced another unexpected obstacle: traffic jams. Several teams had decided to make their attempt on the same day, leading to a bottleneck at critical points like the Hillary Step, a steep and narrow rock face just below the summit. Climbers had to wait in line, burning precious oxygen and losing body heat. The cold was biting, and the wind cut through their clothing like knives, but they were determined. Each step brought them closer to their goal. The summit was so close they could almost touch it. Just as the first climbers began to reach the summit, the weather took a sudden and terrifying turn. A powerful storm rolled in, catching everyone off guard. The clear skies were quickly replaced by dark clouds, fierce winds, and heavy snowfall. The temperature plummeted and visibility dropped to almost zero. Those still on the mountain found themselves in a dire situation. The path that had been clear moments ago was now hidden under a thick blanket of snow. Climbers struggled to find their way, some becoming disoriented and separated from their teams. The storm was relentless, a whiteout that swallowed everything in its path. Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, both experienced guides, tried desperately to keep their teams together. But the storm was too powerful. The winds howled like a pack of wolves, and the snow fell so thick that it was hard to see even a few feet ahead. Some climbers, exhausted and running low on oxygen, sat down, unable to continue. They were frozen to the bone, their fingers and toes numb from the cold. Others pressed on, hoping to find shelter or a familiar landmark. But the mountain showed no mercy. One wrong step could mean a fall into a deep crevasse or off a steep cliff, a plunge into darkness from which there was no return. As the hours passed, the situation grew more desperate. Rob Hall, who had reached the summit with one of his clients, Doug Hansen, tried to descend. But Doug was exhausted, struggling to move. Rob refused to leave him behind, showing the true spirit of a leader. He radioed for help, his voice calm but urgent. "I'm stuck at the top with Doug," he said. "We need help," but the storm made any rescue attempt nearly impossible. Those at lower altitudes tried to ascend, but the fierce winds and blinding snow forced them back. They could hear the wind howling through the radio, a constant reminder of the fury they faced. Scott Fisher, too, was in trouble. He had been feeling unwell for most of the climb, but he had pushed on, determined to reach the summit. Now he was stuck, unable to move. His team members tried to help him, but they were exhausted and running out of oxygen. The storm raged on, and as night fell, temperatures dropped even further. The cold was unbearable. Fingers and toes went numb, frostbite set in. Some climbers managed to find a spot to huddle together, trying to stay warm, sharing whatever little body heat they had left. Others were not so lucky, lost in the blizzard with no shelter in sight. The mountain was unforgiving, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The storm continued through the night, a terrifying mix of wind, snow, and ice that seemed to go on forever. With each passing hour, the chances of survival grew slimmer. Climbers were scattered across the mountain, some huddled in groups, others alone, clinging to rocks or small outcrops, trying to survive the night. Base camp tried to coordinate a rescue, but the conditions were too severe. Helicopters could not fly in such weather, and the paths up the mountain were too dangerous to climb in the dark. The radio chatter was filled with desperate voices, each call a cry for help that went unanswered. As dawn broke, the storm began to ease slightly, but the mountain was still shrouded in thick clouds. The climbers who survived the night were cold, weak, and disoriented. Beck Weathers, a climber who had been left for dead, somehow regained consciousness. Despite severe frostbite and snow blindness, he managed to stumble back to camp. His survival was nothing short of a miracle. He had been exposed to the elements for hours, his body frozen, yet he found the strength to keep moving. His story brought a glimmer of hope to those still at base camp, a small sign that perhaps not all was lost. But for others, hope was fading fast. Rob Hall was still at the top, unable to move. His last radio call was heartbreaking. "Please don't worry," he told his wife, who was thousands of miles away in New Zealand. "I'm comfortable. I'm with Doug and we'll wait for a break in the weather," but the break never came. Scott Fisher, too, succumbed to the cold, his body found later by climbers who had managed to ascend. The mountain had claimed its victims, and the rescuers could do nothing but watch and wait. Over the next few days, rescue efforts continued, but the focus shifted from saving lives to recovering bodies. The storm had left a trail of destruction, and the mountain was littered with abandoned gear and oxygen tanks. The climbers who survived were brought down, many with severe frostbite, some barely conscious. They were heroes, but also victims of a mountain that showed no mercy. Helicopters made dangerous flights to retrieve the injured, braving high winds and thin air. For many, it was a race against time to save limbs and lives from the damage caused by the cold. As the days went on, the full extent of the disaster became clear. 8 climbers had lost their lives in a single day, making it one of the deadliest days in Everest's history. The world watched in shock as the events unfolded, and questions were raised about the safety and ethics of high-altitude climbing. Why did so many climbers decide to push for the summit despite the worsening weather? Were the guides too focused on reaching the top, ignoring the signs of danger? And most importantly, what could be done to prevent such a tragedy from happening again? The mountain had taught a harsh lesson, one that would be remembered for years to come. Everest, with all its beauty and allure, is also a place of great danger, where nature's fury can turn a dream into a nightmare in an instant. The survivors carried these memories with them, a constant reminder of the fine. The 1996 Everest disaster was a wake-up call for the mountaineering community. 8 people had lost their lives in a single day, making it one of the deadliest days in Everest's history. The world watched in shock as the events unfolded, and questions were raised about the safety and ethics of high-altitude climbing. Why did so many climbers decide to push for the summit despite the worsening weather? Were the guides too focused on reaching the top, ignoring the signs of danger? And most importantly, what could be done to prevent such a tragedy from happening again? In the months that followed, there was intense debate among climbers, guides, and mountaineering experts. Some blamed the commercialization of Everest, with too many inexperienced climbers attempting the summit. Others pointed to the unpredictable weather and the inherent risks of climbing at such high altitudes. But one thing was clear: changes needed to be made. New regulations were introduced, requiring climbers to have more experience and better preparation. The use of supplemental oxygen became more strictly regulated, and climbers were encouraged to turn back if conditions were not ideal. But even with these changes, Everest remains a dangerous place. The mountain does not discriminate. It does not care if you are experienced or a novice, if you are strong or weak. It is a place where nature rules and where human limits are constantly tested. For those who survived the 1996 disaster, the memories remain vivid. They remember the faces of their friends and teammates, the sound of the wind howling, the feel of the cold biting into their skin. They remember the fear and the helplessness, the moments of hope and despair. And they remember the lesson that Everest taught them, that even the best preparations can be undone by the power of nature, and that sometimes the mountain wins. The story of the 1996 Everest disaster is a story of courage, of determination, and of the fine line between triumph and tragedy. It is a story that reminds us of the limits of human endurance and the dangers of pushing beyond those limits. And it is a story that continues to inspire climbers from around the world who come to Everest seeking not just a summit, but a deeper understanding of themselves and the world around them.